Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Gird Up Podcast. My name is Charlie Ungemach. I'm the founder and curator of what's going on here at Gird Up. Unfortunately, I'm also the sound tech, and I forgot to turn on my phantom power for this episode. So you've probably noticed already, if you're watching on video, that the words I'm saying are not lining up with my lips. That's my fault. But Pastor Berg sounds great. So we're going to keep this podcast rocking and rolling. It's going to operate just the way that it normally does. But you may notice that the audio doesn't quite line up, or maybe the question doesn't exactly line up with what Pastor Berg is saying. That's entirely my fault and not his, so I just hope you're willing to deal with that. This content is free for anyone and everyone who wants it, and that's possible because of listeners like you that choose to support the show. So please, Pastor Berg's episode is excellent. The other interviews we've been doing lately are absolutely awesome. I'm very, very excited for what we got going on right now and the things that we're bringing to you in the future. So if you'd like to support the work that we do here at Gird Up as we flood the internet with confessional content and prepare the people of God for whatever lies ahead, please consider going into show notes, clicking on a link to the website, and making a cup of coffee donation there. Our guest today is Professor Michael Berg from Wisconsin Lutheran College. He's going to introduce himself in just a minute. He's a wonderful man, wrote a wonderful book that we're going to talk about on vocation. But he's going to introduce himself better than I ever could. So here's Professor Berg.
A lot of the students on campus just call me Berg. Like I'm back in college. Like both, I teach at Wisconsin Lutheran College, but also help out at Wisconsin Lutheran High School. And I don't know if they talk to each other, but I get Berg from both of them. Like, hey, Berg. I don't know if that's an insult or a compliment.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Is that are you cool with that?
I'm fine with whatever.
You could. I mean, I know many, for better or for worse, I know more than a couple of pastors that have insisted that they be told that.
When I sign my emails, I say pastor. I'm a pastor who happens to teach rather than the other way around. So how about that?
Now, you had a career as a parish pastor before you got into the academic world. Is that right?
I did 12 years. Yeah.
And whereabouts was that ministry?
In western Minnesota.
Very cool.
That's right.
Small town?
Like you wouldn't believe. There was 10,000 people in the county. The county had two stoplights, but one was a rumor. I only saw one of them. So it was pretty rural, but it was beautiful, and it was big church actually, and a young church for a rural area. So it was an awesome experience.
Now, that's got to be quite a transition going from a small town like that to the Milwaukee area.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a city kid growing up, so this is a little bit more like home. But yeah, it was a change for my family. My youngest daughter said when we moved here, she said, "You stole my childhood." She was only half joking. She's fine. She's fine.
Now, you, as part of your academic work, have done quite a bit of writing, and part of the reason I asked you on the show today, really the big reason, is that I love your book on vocation, which I know is back in the archives a little bit now. I read it many years ago, but I've been looking for an opportunity to interview you about it. Now, vocation is something that gets thrown around a lot. That word, at least, gets thrown around a lot, and we talk about it at our elementary schools when you're taking catechism class, and we talk about it at our area Lutheran high schools, but I'm not convinced that everybody really understands exactly what vocation actually is, what that word really means. So if you could, please, put vocation in your own words. What does it mean? What does vocation mean?
Yeah, just your point about it's kind of a ubiquitous term right now, and it wasn't even in my lifetime, and so I'm glad that people are talking about it. But yeah, when a word gets thrown around a lot, it loses the meaning, right? And so I think the best way to think about vocation is first define the term that it means calling, right? And you can see the word voice there, vocation. Vocation, though, in a biblical sense, is going to have three components. And this is where a lot of people go off track. Component number one is you have to have a caller, if there's a voice, right? You have to have a caller. Then you have to have the person who is called. That would be specifically the Christian. Not that people who are not Christian do not have jobs that they could even define as callings, but the atheist lawyer is not going to think that he's called by God to be a lawyer. So it's. And then here's the one that we miss is neighbor. You need a neighbor. And so I think we would define vocation as God calling a Christian to a neighbor relationship in which he is going to love the neighbor through the vocation itself and the person. And that way he's going to put the person on as a mask and he's going to do the work. So it's God's love through me to my neighbor. And one of the problems with vocation, especially in higher education, and not in an academic setting, but in a mission setting, like find your vocation, find your calling, right? It's almost always curved inward. Find your calling, and that comes from the idea of self-actualization, the idea I have these certain traits that I found out by taking a 45-minute quiz, you know, strength finders, which is fine. And then I go find this, and then somehow, as Os Guinness said, God is the celestial uh, uh, like person who's going to find you a job, right? And he puts you right where you're going to be fulfilled. Well, it's a curved inward, and I would argue that that's too small of a thing, and rather to be curved outward, that God's actually loving your neighbor through you. You're going to benefit from this vocation for sure, but if you don't have the neighbor, you've kind of missed the point.
Okay. So, to what degree then would you say that we choose our own vocation?
Yes, this is a very difficult question. Um, uh, and I think it's similar to many things the way God operates with us. Can I look back upon my life and I say, God led me to this, God chose this for me, God chose me for this? Absolutely. But in the moment, he allows you to make these decisions, right? And the easiest way that I use to explain this is put yourself into the father-child relationship. There are certain things with my children that yeah, I gave them the decision to do this. I want you to make the decision here, knowing full well that the way I formed them through interactions with me and the family, the things I exposed them to, the education that I provided for them was leading them to a specific place. And so God, and this is something I don't know we talk about enough. God respects you enough to say, "Go ahead, kid, make this decision," right? And so that's, I think, what you're onto here is one of the problems. Like, how do I know that I'm fulfilling this calling? How do I know? And right away, you have curved yourself inward, looking for a feeling. You're looking for an answer, an identity, a purpose inside of yourself. Don't do that. Look outside of yourself. So the question is, who's in front of you? What opportunities are in front of you? Who needs God's love in front of you? And more often than not, the answer will eventually, you know, come to fruition. Sometimes it's because I need a paycheck and this is the only job I can get. Well, that's where God has called you, you know? And hopefully the people around you, including your boss, is going to fulfill his or her vocation enough to say, I'm going to give this employee the opportunity to grow or to move to a different job or even to a different, completely different industry, right? So that's kind of how God operates, doesn't it? Right? He says to Thomas, stop doubting and believe. You believe. And then later he's going to say, just so you know, the Holy Spirit created that faith in you.
Love it. But pretty much everything you've said so far could be twisted for someone to say, like, you should never really be shifting or changing vocation, right? Like,
Mhm, mhm.
you shouldn't have left the pastorate to become a professor. I shouldn't have left the teacherage to
Yep,
become a student for ministry. How do you explain that?
absolutely. And this has been a criticism of the Lutheran doctrine of vocation, although I don't think it holds water. And um, and maybe a misunderstanding of First Corinthians 7, where St. Paul is talking about people who are converted to the faith. And he says, just stay in the position that you're at. Like, okay, you were poor, now you're going to be Christian. Don't expect that all of a sudden now you're going to be a landowner. And he's thinking in an eschatological way that we don't like. he's thinking Jesus is coming back next Tuesday. So he's not thinking like, okay, now this is a new career path. And I think that's a little bit of a problem with American Christianity, that we make Jesus into this guy who's going to make me, I'm going to find this self-fulfillment in Christ, in myself, right? It's still a curved inward kind of idea. So one thing that helps this is to say, it's not just that you're in a vocation where God has called you to serve a neighbor. It's also that you are being served by about a million other people that God has called in their vocations to serve you. And a part of that would be opportunities that present yourself to flourish, to go from flipping burgers for a while to manager, to maybe going back to school and getting a degree for accounting or something like that. And so there's no prohibition to changing vocations. In fact, God may make it very obvious to you that He wants you to change a calling, and you look back, and this, I think, hopefully we have time to talk about this. You look back and go, oh, I was in that position because I wasn't ready for this. God formed me for something in the future. And so not only is there no prohibition from changing vocations, um, that actually may be just how God is operating in a very obvious way. Now, some vocations don't change. I am the husband of my wife until we go to heaven or until one of us passes away. There's each vocation is different in that way.
Right, and that's a good example of a place where if the vocation is going to change, it's because the Lord Himself changes it. But I can also see somebody saying, "Oh boy, this is a lot of pressure."
Mm.
Like the Lord has given me opportunity, so it's my responsibility as a Christian to be, climbing the ladder or pushing towards things that are better, or constantly always chasing whatever's next, right? And climbing in my current vocation because God's given me opportunity. Now it's my job and my responsibility to take that to the nth degree, regardless of what it is, even how miserable I might be, because God has given me opportunity, and I, somehow owe Him or something. To climb the ladder or find worldly success in this particular lane of vocation because the Lord has given me opportunity here. How would you address that?
Yeah, the answer, of course, is yes and no, right? One good line about vocation is vocation is always in the here and the now, right? Who's in front of you? What's the task that has been placed in front of you? Do that in trust, and trust. And opportunities come when opportunities come. And yeah, there are times when we are slow in learning. There are times when we make excuses. You can think of Moses doing that. You can think of quite a few people in the Bible resisting this, right? The question becomes, how do you know that God is calling you? Well, in the way that He does everything else through means. You got friends, you got parents, you got coaches, you got teachers, you got mentors. Put it all together, right? Um, and I think that there is, especially in an uh, affluent society, where you actually have the ability for to move up socially, which, by the way, we should just stop and mention. That's not the case for the vast majority of the history of the world, and maybe even for a lot of people, maybe even the majority of people today. And kind of a side note, what a tragedy it is. I have to imagine that there's quite a few people living in third world countries that, if they were here, would be engineers and doctors and lawyers. But that doesn't make them less. They are put into a position where they're suffering. Maybe they have to be a subsistence farmer, but they're loving their family by doing that. And I imagine heaven being this sabbatical where everybody gets to rest from those 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 duties of day-to-day life because of a sinful world. I just need to survive, and they get to be what they were always intended to be. I don't know, like that dude who's a subsistence farmer is now engineering something in heaven. I don't know. I'm speculating here, of course. That's right, you know? So, um, we can get lost in, and it can be a burden of an affluent society of a, I'm never good enough unless I'm progressing. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. Again, it's a curved inward thing rather than a curved outward thing. Um, I think we can legitimately say that it's a tragedy when somebody doesn't push themselves. Okay, fine. It's a sinful world. But at the same time, when somebody maybe gives up a career for to take care of a parent or a spouse who needs medical attention, that's just as beautiful, right? And I think one of the things we need to get rid of is this is not a competition. Love is not a competition, right? And so I think if you have the opportunity to move on in a career from a human point of view that says this is better, God bless you. God blesses that. That's fantastic. If that does not come your way, God will bless that too, right? So, and I think if we always are thinking about moving up the ladder, um, it's a recipe for being miserable. And the people that really understand calling and really understand human flourishing get lost in the craft of their job, right? And they're not concerned with what the world thinks about it. Then maybe that's the key, right? So when you stop thinking about the mere adulations of man, a promotion, money, the house, all that kind of stuff, and lose yourself in the craft of what you're doing, that's a beautiful gift. When you look at the clock at 10 a.m. and you say, it's already 10, I had so much more I wanted to do today. That's a good day. A bad day is when you go, oh, 10 a.m. I thought it was lunchtime already. Right? You can lose yourself in the craft of every single vocation. And in my book, I talk about going into a bathroom and this old janitor is training a new janitor, and he's telling how he does this, and this is the right way to do it. And it was just remarkable to me that he took pride and craft in his job. And he was doing it in front of of a stranger, me, without any kind of shame that somehow he was less because he wasn't the professor, he was the janitor. I'm like, that's vocation right there. And that can be a hard thing, right? Because we're geared towards success. But if you stop looking at what man looks at and look at what God looks at, well, you can find a great amount of peace.
Yeah, thank you. Um, I read somewhere. I think actually I think it's a John Eldridge quote. So you gotta make sure you take that with a grain of salt. But somewhere in one of John Eldridge's books, he gives advice on this topic, and what he says is that Christians should not look at the world and ask what the world needs. Instead, they should look at what makes them come alive and pursue that and pursue opportunities to do that instead. Do you think that's good advice?
I think it properly understood it could be. You could misunderstand that and say, well, I'm not going to be happy unless I'm a starving artist or something like that. Well, that's again a curved inward thing, right? I At the same time, I think you can look at every task, including every vocation, and lose yourself into it, right? And lose yourself into the doing it right for the sake of itself, and more importantly, for the sake of a neighbor. And so you can get yourself excited about something, even if it is not deemed valuable to the world. So an example may be like, okay, you're an accountant and you're tasked with one sheet, a spreadsheet of the month's finances for this whatever meeting with the bigwigs, and they look at it and they okay, go whatever, and goes with the recycling. Um, but to you, that was a work of art, right? It literally was a work of art. The right amount of information, the right where it was on the page, so that the CEO know exactly where to work or whatever, and you're serving the greater community, you're serving the employees. your employers, the community around, all that kind of stuff. And maybe you don't get credit for it. And maybe nobody's excited about it, but you can be. And how do you do that? Well, you start off with saying, this is important. You know why you know it's important? Because God said, I need you to do that. And I think that's the key. God says, I need you to do that. And a great line from a now departed professor, Daniel Deutschlander. Oh man, just so great. He said, God chooses to need you, which just right away you're like, what are you talking about? You, you don't, it's an oxymoron. You don't choose to need anything. You don't wake up saying, I choose to need air. You need it. Um, and let alone God needing me. But how profound, what respect he gives us that he says, I need you for this thing. You're my you're my gal for this. You're my guy for this job. Now, in classic Deutschlander fashion, after he would say, God chooses to need you, lifting you up, he would say, so you're not a waste of space, you dummy. But what he was saying was, do you understand that you need purpose? And you're striving for purpose. And if you strive to fulfill that very human need for greatness, epicness, purpose in salary, in prestige, and promotion, you will be disappointed. You need something divine. And I think this is very applicable to today while we're trying to figure out our importance and all that kind of stuff. People in the medieval time, I don't think thought about that because their jobs were right in front of them. Survival was the task of the day, right? But for us, we understand we're made for greatness, made in the image of God. And I'm telling you, you could win the Super Bowl 10 times in a row and you would have won 11th. You'd never be satisfied because you're made in the image of God. You can never be satisfied with the mere adulations of man. So you need a divine purpose, and vocation does provide that for you. And that's why Luther quipped, when a father, he said, father changes a dirty diaper, the angels sing in heaven. Well, of course, God wants clean rear ends. He loves those little kids. You're doing God's work. Could he have snapped his finger and had that diaper changed? Sure. That's not how he operates. He operates through means so he can be intimate with us, and specifically in vocation so that you understand your importance and your identity.
I can still see somebody though really struggling, right? Knowing all of that and saying, "Well, but the Lord prepared in advance good works for me to do." And so I have a responsibility
All
to
right, Paul.
do those good works. That's that's intense, right? Like I've got to figure out what those good works are and do them.
Yeah. Um, so this is what I tell my students in college. I say, you're told to have a 5-year plan, internships. We even talk about branding yourself, like with a resume and stuff like that, make yourself hireable, all that kind of stuff. And then I say, I think that's adorable that you think that this is going to work out the way you think it is. It's not going to, and that's okay. It makes life exciting. Um, but understand that God is crafting good deeds for you in advance. Like 5 years from now, some of you are going to be preparing lesson plans for second graders. It's preparing you for putting an IV in a patient 10 years from now at a hospital you don't even know exists right now. This is trust, right? And you have to trust, um, because the relationship of love assumes trust. And God loves you, and He says, "Trust me, trust me." And there's quite a few benefits from that, right? Not only saving faith, of course, but can you imagine having everything planned out? A, how boring that would be. B, um, how you'd lose spontaneity, you would lose hope in the future. It would just be something less, right? And quite frankly, you have to remind yourself you don't know enough. You don't have the perspective that God does. You just don't know. And so Know this, that there's a promise that God is forming you for the sake of a neighbor later on. I hate to say trust the process, but but that's sort of what we're after here. Now, I'm dodging your question still. How do you know? And the answer is you don't know because you don't have the perspective or you can't get into the will of God. Um, but I think you'll be able to look back and say, that's why God put me there. And so I keep going back to that phrase. It's what's in front of you. What is in front? If you're a student, that is what is in front of you. And part of that is to apply for internships and jobs. And if you have a choice between two or three jobs, don't go, oh, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. The tyranny of choice. Stop and go, are you kidding me? How blessed I am to have choices? And then make a choice and then go. And then just go. One of great lines from Luther was, now that you're freed by the gospel, you can venture all things. And so I think maybe underneath all of this is you're allowed to take chances and you're allowed to make mistakes because you know where you're going and because you know God will get you there. And so go for it. Make a mistake. It's all right. You can venture all things because eternity is secure. This this angst of decisions and the tyranny of choice comes from an idea that my future is not yet written. But if your future is written, go for it. And maybe you fall flat on your face. So what? That's where God wanted you in the moment. This kind of reminds me of when I was a rookie pastor, and I came in, and like the first year was just a bunch of people coming in, sort of saying, "Okay, new pastor, I'm going to come in with like, okay, just so you know, here's all my family baggage." Before you hear about it from the rumor mill. So, just coming out of seminary, and my mental Rolodex is like, what passage do I use to solve this problem? And instantly, well, that's not how it worked. And so I found myself saying, I wish I had a magic wand to solve your problem. I don't, but I do know. And I can't speculate on why God is allowing this suffering in your world or your mistakes or whatever. But I do know you're exactly where God needs you right now. If for no other reason than he's beating the false piety out of you. So you have to go to him. And I think I could say that advice to people young in their career who are bound by this angst of choice is to say, make a decision, go. And if you fail, I can still rightfully say, God, at that moment, God needed you. And you may not be able to ever figure out why until kingdom come. But that's a part of faith, is trusting that God is forming you for this. So my advice is stop asking the question of like, am I supposed to do this decision or not? Just go. Venture all things. It's gonna be fine. Easy for me to say.
Well, easy to say doesn't make it any less true. Um, you bring to mind a quote from the greatest of American theologians, the great David Goggins. Um, in one of his books, he writes about this scene that he imagines where
Yeah.
he arrives at the gates of heaven, and whether it's Saint Peter or whoever it is, right, is standing at the pearly gates, and he's got this list, and I arrive at heaven. But then when I arrive there, St. Peter looks and says, okay, well, here are the good things
Yeah,
that
yeah.
God prepared in advance for you to do. So you're supposed to hold the pull up record. Check, you did that. You're supposed to be a Navy SEAL. Check, you did that. You were supposed to be a father. Check, you did that. Whatever the things are, right? And what he says is, I don't want to be the guy who on the last day I go to heaven and I arrive at the pearly gates, and God says, yeah, you did some awesome stuff, but what about these other things that I prepared in advance for you to do? Like, what other things were there that God wanted me to do that I didn't? Do I need to be concerned about that as a Christian? Is that part of my thinking about
Yeah.
vocation?
Well, let me start with the law. Yeah, of course. course that, I mean, you're going to be judged by that. I don't care if you became a pastor and did all the outwardly supposedly more religious whatever. There's always things left undone, right? So yeah, when I'm made righteous on account of Christ, I'm free from that accusation of the law. And I think we'd go to Matthew 20, 25, where something similar happens, right? Where Jesus goes to the sheep and says, or to the goats and says, "Well, I was in prison, you never visited me, and I was sick, and you never, I was naked, and you never clothed me." And then the self righteousness kicks in and goes, "Well, we didn't know, we didn't see, and you're trying to justify that, right?" And then, but it's what's curious is he goes to the sheep and says the same thing. And the sheep are like, "When were you ever in prison? I don't know. What are you talking about? Whatever you did for the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me." Now, that could still be law because I haven't done what I should for all the least of Jesus' brothers around me, for sure. But if I understand vocation and righteousness through faith and not through law, I look back and go, yeah, but God did work through me for these different things, right? And but that wasn't the point that I did them. The point was the love of neighbor. And I think this is an important thing about vocation too, is God's going to get his work done with or without you, right? And I think that alleviates some of the pressure too. Like, how can I be a father and also work in whatever and have to deal with ailing parents or whatever, and like I can't do it all, I can't fulfill all these vocations. Welcome to the club. What God does is that through other people and their vocations, He got you covered. It's going to be fine. And I think that's a shoulder dropping exhale moment. And ironically, you actually probably ended up being more productive because you were free from the anxiety of not doing enough. So, the law says, yeah, for sure. Like, and you've hurt people. You've hurt people in your vocations, but you're free from that accusation of the law, and Christ is working through you anyway, because that's how he operates. Like, you look at the Old Testament great heroes of faith, they're all jerks. Like, you and I are better than Abraham. I'm willing to bet. I never, did what he did to his wife Sarai in Egypt, right? But that's not the point. He believed and it was credited to him as righteousness. And so to be freed from that nagging law is the key. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier, this is jumping back a little bit, you mentioned earlier that we often see, well, when we look at people that clearly aren't reaching it,
Mhm.
we see that as a tragedy.
Mhm.
Why do you think that is?
Yeah. I think it is because we innately understand that we were made not just for greatness, but perfection. It's a very strong apologetic argument for the existence of God, even though it's not a scientific or logical argument. Like, what makes me different than the animals? Well, quite a few things. But the thing that really makes me different is that I'm imago Dei. I was made in the image of God. And because of that, I I strive for greatness in a way that the squirrels do not. So the example I use with my students is the squirrels don't lay out in the lawn at night, look up into the sky and wonder what it would be like to go to the moon. We do, and we did something about it, right? They're about survival. They're about keeping the species around and burying nuts in the ground for to get through winter. If a human being does that, we rightfully say, "Oh, that's sad," whether it be because of their lack of motivation, because of corruption in the government that's in their state, or for whatever reason. We see that as tragic, and rightfully so. And I think that idea of greatness then drives us um, to do all the great things humans have done, but also drives us to just great tragedies, right? And sometimes mental illness, right? Maybe not mental illness is not the right word, but getting in my head kind of thing. And the trick is to say, but but the way we judge greatness in the world is different than what the way God judges greatness, right? And so if I can get away from that law of my greatness must be I have to be the senator from the state of Wisconsin, and I look at my bathroom that needs to be cleaned and I go, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. And those moments are rare in a broken world. I get that. But notice that there are moments, and here I think is a good point to make. There are moments that are rare in the world, but there are moments when you do what is right and beautiful, not because you're going to get credit, not because it's the right thing to do, not because you're giving glory to God as if he needed that, but because it's just who you are, because it's who God made you to be, a saint, still a sinner, but also righteous in Christ. Those are very rare moments, but when you have them, that is that is when you are truly flourishing, right? And you're meant for something, you know you're meant for something great, and you're doing something that's great because it's God's work, even if it's cleaning the toilet. Yeah.
Yeah. So to double down on that, the question I get a ton when I do my work with Mormons, it makes sense because the religion is all about you know, fulfilling my purpose, essentially, without better words to say that. Um,
And the
literally becoming like
yeah, and the criteria is I am successful. Yeah,
right,
yeah.
yeah. The question then, when we start talking about doctrine, one of their first pushbacks then is, well, what is your purpose then?
Hmm.
You mentioned God doesn't need my glory,
Hmm.
right? You mentioned also that my ability to check off the list of things that God may have prepared is also a distorted way of looking at this. So how would you answer that question then?
Back
As a Christian, what is my purpose?
Mhm. It is to be loved by God and to love neighbor, if you want to put it that way. Um, and implicit in that is freedom and freedom from the accusation of the law that I have not done enough. Stop asking that question. Just stop asking that question. It's the wrong question. It's a question of being in prison, right? How do I get free? And so you can use the example of somebody says freedom is going to be financial freedom. So I make a bunch of money and I'm doing all these things, and then you realize more money, more problems. Now I'm trapped just as I was when I didn't make the six-figure salary. Um, and the tragedy, of course, is that you can convince yourself that that freedom, that prison is actually freedom, right? So to be loved by God is to be freed from the accusation of the law because he loved you unconditionally enough to make you righteous. He made you right with him. And then freedom turns into love. And this is a real tricky thing, but I think it's quite profound. That true freedom looks a lot like love. Yeah. Because if I'm addicted to sin, and I am, because if I wasn't, I would have stopped a long time ago. And I mean, I'm an addict. I mean, I know this is not going to end well for me, but I can't help myself, right? So if I look at freedom to do whatever I want, however I want, with whomever I want, as often as I want, a very shallow way of looking at freedom, but I'm just indulging in my sinful nature, which I'm going to do because I'm an addict. Not only am I not free, I've convinced myself that my prison is freedom. Well, if the opposite of sin is selfless love, then freedom is actually love. Now, we don't like that because love says to give of myself. Well, that's not about me. But if you're free from the accusation of the law and free from sin, you're free to flourish. And I would argue that flourishing and love go hand in hand as well. So, so to say it again, I'm free from the accusation of the law because I'm loved by God. I'm freed to enjoy God's good gifts that He has given me through other vocations without guilt. Should never feel guilty about being rich. Should be generous. and not a jerk, but you shouldn't feel guilty about God giving you a gift. And that freedom then turns into this beautiful thing called love. And then going back to that idea, when you lose yourself in the craft of something and love is something, you're not thinking about the glory of God. You're not thinking about ethics. You're not thinking about anything else but just doing this for the sake of itself and for the sake of neighbor. That's so free. It doesn't look like freedom from our point of view, from a sinful point of view, but freedom actually looks a lot like love. So the answer is to be loved and to love, but implicit in that is, of course, salvation and freedom.
So if love and flourishing are kind of tied up hand in
Hmm.
hand, you've heard the phrase you can't pour out from an empty bucket,
Hmm.
right? Um, with my second graders, talking about make sure we fill each other's love buckets,
Hmm.
mix it up, because then they got love to pour out on you too.
Hmm.
Um, vocation can be real tough then, and carrying out various vocations can be real tough if my proverbial bucket isn't
Hmm.
filled. Um, what if the people around me aren't
Yeah.
doing their turn,
Yeah.
essentially filling my bucket as
Yeah.
well?
Yeah. And that's a difficult one because, we talk about like getting rid of toxic relationships and I got to love myself first. And it just all kind of smells of pop psychology and not a true self-sacrificing agape love that we find in the Bible. At the same time, we understand that, um, yeah, it can be really detrimental when you only give and aren't given back. I think a couple helpful things. One is to stop every day, and it sounds so cheesy, but count your blessings. And the reason you should do that for your mental health, like we literally know that people who practice gratitude are healthier and live longer and have less stress and all that kind of stuff. To
Well, that's even something that's stressed big time in the
yeah.
secular world.
Oh yeah.
What does it even mean,
Right.
secular world, right?
It's one of those things like in our modern scientific world, they're like, well, we figured it out. And the Christians are like, yeah, you should have read the Psalms. We already knew this. But our modern world needs the data and needs the yeah. So but we can fall into self-pity really quickly, right? So I like to think about this room right now, and I use this in the book. How many people did God use in their vocations to love me? Well, there was a lighting guy, there was a tile guy, there's an architect, there was the donors, I mean, we could be here all day. And the idea, I think it's a false idea to say that I'm going to give more love than I receive. I think that that's impossible. Love is not a zero-sum game. Um, so you could never give as much as you have been given just by the fact that you're alive, right? That there's an economy, that there's all these things working for you. You got to stop and think about those things. And I think that's maybe key number one. Uh, Before that, of course, is like, dude, Jesus died on the cross for you. Like, okay, like it's gonna be okay. But here's something to think about, and I'll get to your question eventually, but here's something to think about too is it's not your love. It's God's love through you. And can I tell a story? Do we have time? Okay, okay. So um I remember being on this campus where Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary, Mequon, Wisconsin. And my I found out my wife was pregnant with our first child. This is not the story, but and I'm the oldest of six kids. And so nothing has surprised me being about a father. Like I knew how to change a diaper. I knew how to hold a baby. I wasn't that guy who was like holding it like a football. But that actually did not make me confident about being a father, maybe petrified because I knew the late nights, I knew the frustrations were coming. I'm like, I don't know I can do this. And then I held that baby girl in my arm, like I had a glass ceiling of love that was a false ceiling. And I'm not lying. I remember being on this campus, I was in the library, and my wife called me and said, we're pregnant again. And I started thinking immediately, I'm gonna have to fake loving this second kid. because there was no way I could take the love that I had for my first daughter and share it because that's not how love works. And so I remember thinking like, dude, I'm gonna ruin this kid. I'm gonna have to fake it my whole life that I'm gonna love because I'm not gonna. I got another glass ceiling. Well, I held that second baby girl in my arms, and my second glass ceiling. And it finally dawned on me: the love is unlimited. The love is infinite because it's God's love through me. I'm finite. I won't have all the money and the time and the patience for each one. I'm gonna have to divide those things up, but I'll never have to divide the love up because that's not how love works. So if you're getting tapped out, remind yourself, it's not your love, right? It's something else that is doing that. So then the question becomes, okay, it's not so much that I'm emptying out of my love and my passion or whatever, but it's probably a time thing. It's probably a resource thing. It's maybe a mental health thing or whatever. Then you start saying, okay, I got multiple vocations. Everybody has multiple vocations. So, I'm father, brother, son, citizen, pastor, professor, literally neighbor, those kinds of things. And those things do bump into each other, right? And so the question becomes, have I emptied myself into one vocation and not another vocation? And and maybe that's the problem, right? And so I think to use a simple example and then expand it to something profound, I shouldn't feel guilty about I got to go away for a week on business. That means I'm going to miss two little league games and a flute recital. I just want to tell young parents, you don't have to go to every little league game. My parents didn't. Right? That was not like, do go. Yeah, we'll drop you off. Whatever. That's fine. Right? Like you're allowed to say no. You may, however, have to say no to a promotion at work or have to go to a job that isn't as demanding because you realize dad needs to be home more. Now, I'm not talking about life balance here because that's another adorable thing when people are like, oh, life balance. People say that. I'm like, you must not have children, right? But in the end, you get life balance by asking yourself who needs the love the most? Who needs God's love through me the most? So, freedom in the gospel, you're never going to give love. You're always going to give more love than you receive. Start thinking about the in a gratitude way, but you can say no. You're allowed to say no for the sake of something else. Um, Now, to the original question, like people are pulling from me and not giving back. Well, those are tough. Those are tough situations where I think the advice is going to be different in every situation. But I think as a pastor, you could definitely give pastoral advice to say, okay, so you had this domineering parent that is whatever your time. You're allowed to put boundaries there for your own mental health, not not just so that you are better, but so that you can do the other things and you can appreciate the other things that God is giving you. So to think about the different spheres of vocation and to be able to say no and knowing that God will get the work done with or without you, I think that's finally the freedom we're after here. But knowing full well that you're going to suffer, love assumes suffering in a broken world.
Yeah, absolutely. But it brings another question to mind, and this is anecdotal. Obviously, I don't have data to back this up, but there seems to me to be a number of Christians. Maybe it's not a majority, but a number of Christians who believe that love means that I allow people to take advantage of me. I don't fight back when people take advantage of me. Is that a Christian view
Hmm.
of what
Hmm.
love is?
Yeah, that's a yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think love does assume that in a broken world that you will be taken advantage of, right? I mean, I think that could be a part of the definition. My children take advantage of me, right? And I'm, yeah, most of the time. Um, but then it becomes the question of enablement. Am I enabling somebody, right? and this is a whole nother topic, but like C.S. Lewis, Four Loves and stuff like that. Is it a sort of a philia friendship love, right? Where I'm doing something for you, and if I don't get something in back, that's broken, whatever. I think a lot of times that's the relationship that we think about and conflate that with marriage and parenting in particular. Um, I'm going to be a jerk here, but when someone says I married my best friend, I immediately think you should have more friends. Like you're, if your wife or your husband is your best friend, fine, but like that's a different relationship, right? But parents who want to be the best friends with their children, and often that says, well, then I need them to love me, which means that they're taking advantage of me and I have to give. That's not a true agape love. A true agape love says no. Very often says no. God says no to us. God says none of your business. God says wait. God says count your blessings. That's true love. So I think you can still love by saying, in fact, you may have to say something that's like we need boundaries here, or you're do you understand that you're putting me in a position that that keeps me from flourishing for the sake of others and for the sake of myself. That may be the true loving position to take.
Okay, now I'm gonna circle back a little bit. So some of these are questions you've already kind of sort of answered, but I just want to go
Yeah.
back and make the answers firm and secure for our listeners, so they really get a clear answer to these particular questions. So the first one, you've talked a little bit about the fact that Christians who are faithful in their vocations strive for great things, and that's certainly true. And you even kind of gave permission um, to balance those things out a little bit. I don't like the term balance, but you said like in the pursuit of great things like providing for my family, I might miss a baseball game or two, and that is okay. I don't have to be at every single one. And you've also talked about the fact that it's a tragedy when like we as people we see it as a tragedy when people seem not to live up to their potential, whether that's in work or in home, or maybe both, whatever it might be. So I'm just curious to hear you talk a little bit more about what are the great things that we should be pursuing. How do we decide between which things we're going to pursue? What ultimately is great? Why is it a tragedy when people don't live up to their potential? And let's just talk more about pursuing great things, doing great things, and living up to the God-given potential that we have.
Yeah, I mean, it's equally a tragedy when somebody loses themselves into a job to the point where they cut off all of their vocations, right? A workaholic or something like that. And part of the problem in, again, a capitalistic society, and I'm a good capitalist, um, is um, the idea that you need to find greatness in how much money you make, how many hours you work, all that kind of stuff. That would be the employers, the investors, the bosses sinning against their vocation and not allowing their employees to flourish outside of the job. We have multiple vocations. Um, to that question about greatness, right? First off, we've already talked about this. Man's greatness is different than God's greatness, right? His glory is in the cross, and so uh, a, a father being a good father instead of being an investment banker that goes through the ranks and becomes the CEO, that's actually greatness, right? And we know that. But to the idea of greatness in general, there is something about being on a crew, and I'm not, I'm going to refrain from using the word team here, because I think there's a bit of a distinction that was brought out by author Matthew Crawford. A crew member stands on his own, he has a skill. He's the fine carpentry guy on the carpentry team that's building a house. Um, a team is more of like we have this end goal, and a crew has an end goal too. But a team, it's team first, right? You could see as an individual losing yourself, and God balances the group and the individual, I think, in a very profound way. That's another topic. Um, there is something about being a part of a special crew in a special time in a special place with a special task. It could be a team, wins a championship or something like that. But I'm thinking more along the line of a crew in the ER. That was just a special time. Everything was magic. Think about this at Wittenberg. You have all these great people, like just happen to be in this town of 2,000 people. How does that happen? Is that the hand of God? Well, maybe, sure, but also they fed off each other, right? And there was something that you were just there was greatness there, right? It drove us to something. There's something about that. I think that when we manage hearts in the way where we're like, okay, here's you're working at an accounting firm and you have these nebulous concepts of leadership and teamwork and all that kind of stuff, and you're like, but what did we do? What did we do? Right? The guy is building a house. At the end of that goes, we built that. Do you see that? That's great. That's great. Right? You can do that in the family, right? You take like that once in a lifetime trip. You craft certain traditions or whatever. It was a special time, a special place, and I think we're losing that a little bit. So the greatness is not true greatness is not I won an Emmy. True greatness was there was a team and we did something that nobody ever did before. And the genius of God, when he says, I choose you to do this, is he makes it less about us imitating Christ and more about saying, you are Christ to this person. So Gustav Lindgren, a Lutheran theologian who rediscovered vocation in the 1960s, um, said had a great line about Luther didn't like the idea of imitating the saints. He didn't even like the idea of imitating Christ. Because how could you ever imitate it when you are doing something that has never happened before? Like you and I sitting, lots of people do podcasts, but you and I sitting in this particular time, has never happened before. And to be a part of something that's never happened before on the crew that is God using you as a mask, that's what we mean by greatness rather than what the world thinks. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, I think so.
Yeah, we're losing that. We're losing that idea of like we got together and we did something great. It could be like you and your boys in high school did something really stupidly epic and you tell the story 20 years later. That's what I mean. Except, maybe something a little bit more wholesome.
Yeah, so you kind of stir in my mind or call to my mind the story of my great grandfather. My great grandpa Bud Matthias. He was born in Chicago, was raised in Chicago. It was a hard life there. He was an ice and coal man. Not like I said, not an easy life. And so, for the sake of his wife and his children, he moved
Yeah.
up to Wisconsin, became a
Yeah.
caretaker on some land, and eventually ended up putting uh, parts in cars on the assembly line at the American Motor Company in Kenosha. He drive out there every day and he drive back. And in his mind, he's a great man in my mind, and he joyfully made that sacrifice every day. You could argue he wasn't a
Yeah.
great man because all he's doing is putting bolts in
Yeah.
cars. But in the view of his children and his grandchildren and great
Yeah.
grandchildren, he is a great man. He lived a great life. because he's willing to make these big sacrifices for the sake of his family and those who come after him. And I'm very much a product of the sacrifices he made in a lot of different ways, right? Same thing is true of my
Yeah.
grandpa on the other side. He was a police captain,
Yeah.
who, like, I know not every day on the job as a police officer was easy. I know it was often, in fact, very difficult. But yet he
Right.
wakes up every day and he
Right.
goes to work. And even when he retired, he still kept working.
Yeah.
He was a security guard at a manufacturing plant. He doesn't love going to work every day. He doesn't love working the night shift, I'm
Yeah.
sure. And yet he's willing to
Yeah.
do it and joyfully does it because he sees the way it's a blessing to his family. He sees the way it serves his family. He sees the opportunities it gives his family. And he's serving all of his vocations well by being faithful in his work, by taking care of his family
Yeah.
and his home life, um, even though he's not necessarily doing great things in the eyes of the world, right? How can you not call these things
And
great?
I bet your great grandfather once in a while said, "I wonder if I put the bolt in that car driving down the road." I did that. I did that. And that's the true pride. Sometimes we talk about pride as a bad thing, and it is. I think what's underneath the sinful pride is a self-justification. I'm trying to justify my value before other people, and whether I admit it or not, before God by my works. But there's a good pride. There's a good pride, right? I did that. I was a special time, right? And uh, you know, you can talk, especially old dudes are like this, right? Um, and you're like, oh, what'd you do for a living or whatever? And they'll go on for like an hour on the right way to do something and the wrong way to do something, and griping about how the world has changed or whatever. But there's a sparkle in their eye about, like, I was a part of something that was unique, that was important, that was great. And the guys that talk about that are rarely people who are like CEOs or whatever. Right? They're just like, they're farmers, and they're like, they can talk your ear off about farming. As I said, I was a pastor in a farming community, and I'm like, I got nothing to offer this conversation, but I'm going to let you just keep on going about fertilizer. That's good for you, man. Um, the, that's a gift from God. That's a gift from God that the animals don't get. And I'm afraid too many people don't get because they're wrapped up into career, or they're wrapped up into any number of things, and they're losing the joy of work.
Now, you do warn against spiritual pride. What do you mean when you warn against spiritual pride, and why is that something dangerous?
Well, I think, we talk about pride as like just this sort of like a root of all sin. And okay. Um, but why is it so damning? Literally, it's because you are trying to be right. And that's all righteousness means. In fact, that's all what justification means, to be right with God, to be just. You're trying to find it in works. And if you're doing it by works, then you have said to God, your salvation of me, you making me righteous in Christ, was not good enough. You're rejecting the love. And this is what Paul's after in Romans 1, 2 to 3, and later in 6. I like to think about it two systems: a righteousness by law. I'm right by some sort of law, whether it be beauty, money, whatever cause I'm going to protest today. Yeah. That's all it is. That's all. That's This explains humanity to its core, right? It's why we gossip. It's why we always giving people their resumes and bragging or whatever. We can call it pride, but what we're really doing is this very human thing about trying to find value inside of ourselves. And it's a wage system. I get paid a wage for my work. But then there's a righteousness by faith. Abraham believed and it was credited to him as righteousness. This is a gift. Christ's righteousness is your righteousness. This is the gift system. And I think this help explains Romans 6:23. Paul's like, you want to be in a wage system, a righteousness by law system? Okay, Wages of sin is death. The gift system is a right is eternal life. This is where you're gifted that. And when you're freed from that sort of pride of self-justification, then you can have the proper pride. Then you start boasting in the Lord. And what we mean by boasting in the Lord is like, this guy not only saved me, but put me in this position where I could have joy and I could have a proper pride and I could have a family and a good life. And I didn't need to be rich. I'm true godly contentment. I think that's boasting in the Lord. I think that's the true kind of pride.
Now, perhaps this isn't as related as it seems in my mind,
Uh-huh.
but I'm watching House of David on. It's a series on Amazon Prime. I'm not sure if you've watched that one or not. And frankly, I probably wouldn't be watching it if I wasn't going to podcast about it. It's not terrible. I enjoy it. It's well made. And I do actually enjoy some of the ways that some of the characters are portrayed and such, but that's for a different podcast on a later day. One of the things that has really stuck out to me, though, as it being reflective of the attitude of this age or the attitude of the world or whatever, however you want to say that, is the way that they talk about greatness in people. Right? There's this mysticism going on, this kind of odd, like mystic idea that God is looking at people and he's seeing some sort of like innate greatness in them, and that's why he's using them the way that they are, right? That they have this um, like innate quality that God is planning to use them. It says God plans to use them, but unless they like employ this innate quality of whatever God is seeing on their behalf, like if they don't fulfill their destiny that's provided by God, or however you want to phrase that, then God like is bound. He can't necessarily carry out His plans. So I'm curious about the relationship between God and man. Um, what how do I avoid pride when I'm thinking about the way that God is using me? Is there something in me that makes God say like, "Oh, hey, I'm going to use that guy for this purpose," or is it all God given? Just talk to that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's two things here. I mean, I think we can properly say like, okay, God called me because there was something particular about me for this particular task. Like, I imagine like at the burning bush, God really wanted to say to Moses, like he was like, "Oh, am I Hebrew? Am I Egyptian? Nobody likes me. I'm not accepted by either one." Him go like, "Dum dum, you're like the perfect guy for this job, right? Like you can knock on the door of the Pharaoh and get in, right? But it wasn't because Moses had this particular thing, but was God had formed him for the good deed later on, right? So, I mean, it wouldn't be like you say something about like what should I be when I grow up to little kids or whatever. I mean, I think it's okay to say, what are you good at? What are you good at? What are the gifts God has given you? But to frame it like God is forming you for something else. Going back to that Os Guinness quote that I butchered before, this makes God a celestial employment agent, right? He's like this lead team leader who's putting people in, like a manager of a baseball team, right? Well, if that's true, he's very bad at this because he's made a lot of fathers that aren't really good fathers, and he's made a lot of politicians that if they didn't have the last name and the money probably would have been. So that he doesn't think he's not thinking about you. He's thinking about neighbor. He's thinking about putting you in the position for neighbor, and that's why you can still be satisfied, even though you could have been a doctor if only this, right? Because God said, "Well, I don't care if you're a doctor. I care about the person that I want you to serve today." But the second thing I was thinking about when we talked about is I'm glad you brought the idea of mysticism. Um, mysticism can be something that we can misunderstand. Like, I sort of have this spirit, this outside of the means spiritual connection with God, sort of Gnostic, whatever. At the same time, there is a mystical union, you know, uh, Christ, human and divine, Christ, the power of God's word. in for instance the absolution or the words of institution. We we dare not separate those two things. The words are not symbols of another reality. They are the reality. God's word does have that kind of power. And I wonder if you can extend that to vocation in a careful way. I'm the mask of God. I am Christ to these people. I am Christ. Right now, I am Christ to these people. And that's so much different than God moving chess pieces on a board to hopefully make his outcome. And that makes him less, and it makes me less, and it makes the people I serve less, right? So I like to talk about vocation as a Christological endeavor. When I stand before my students, I am Christ to them. He's putting on me as a mask so that he can teach them. I'm going to mess it up, but it's so they are intimate with him. It's I'm not a symbol of Christ. I am Christ to them in a very profound mystical way, understood correctly. At the same time, since I'm giving a cup of water to the least of these brothers of mine, you did unto me, I'm serving Christ when I serve other people. And I think that's a good distinction, a helpful distinction. We talk about the glory of God way too much. Glory of God this, glory of God that. I have a colleague, Wade Johnston, who likes to make a joke like God's up in heaven and he's sort of floating down. He's becoming deflated. He's like, I'm getting low on glory. I need the people to give me glory, right? The true glory of God's on the cross. And I like to think about it this way, that when you serve your neighbor, lost in the love of neighbor and the craft of the job for the sake of itself, this good gift that God has given you, without any concern about, oh, just so everybody knows that I did this for the glory of God, like virtue signaling, give me a break. When you do it without even thinking about him, because you're so secure in his love and the trust of that he's going to get his work done, that's to his glory. That's to his glory when you're not thinking about it, and you're just lost in it. I think those are the beautiful moments.
Yeah. And that actually leads really well into one of the questions I had written down that we haven't really gotten to yet, but I am really curious about. I want to talk to you about it. Is you make the case, or you point out that people often kind of rush to comfort others by saying, "Oh, you did your best. You did the best you could," and you say instead we should start by saying you are forgiven. Why is that? Why should we start that way? And what are we doing?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's healthy for us to, when people are too hard on themselves to, part of the process is to say, listen, you're being too hard on yourself or whatever. Um, but that's not gospel. And there are times in my ministry, I had this where people were talking themselves out of grace because they were getting the law too much. And so what was my solution to talk them back into grace? How about I just forgive them? Because the power of the word, the gospel word, actually does what I'm trying to convince them to do, which is to relieve them of this. Now, pastoral care later is going to say, no, I don't want you to fall back into that trap. But there's times when, dude, just forgive them. Because even if they're despairing in a way that they logically should not be, there was always a kernel of sin in there anyway. And I use the story about this Navy guy that I met at a hotel parking lot in the book. And he was talking about vocation, even though he wasn't talking about vocation, and he was talking about the guilt. He clearly was an alcoholic later in his life. And he just said, I pushed buttons that killed people, innocent people. And so what am I going to do in that moment? Have a long conversation about his vocation and, it wasn't just doing it. No, I'm like, you're forgiven in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I for, I forgive, right? And that's what people need. I can remember a couple situations where fathers came in and these tough guys, and they tried, after a couple sentences, they just broke down. They had failed because their children were not great. And what do I do there? Be like, I know you're a good father. I don't know if you're a good father. You probably weren't at times. Like, that kid's baptized. God made a promise. He can try to outrun God, but if I'm a betting man and and you're forgiven. I forgive you. I forgive you. Because only the gospel can change hearts, not rationalizing. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah.
It's funny you say that. I remember last year, junior year at the seminary, you're kind of stressed out of your mind. You've never experienced anything quite like this before, and I was getting really frustrated with myself, my own inability to, act the way I should and be performing the way I should in the classroom and so forth. And I'm confessing this to a brother, and I'm so frustrated. And as I'm kind of working myself up into a tizzy, he just stopped me and he literally put his finger in the middle of my chest, and he just said, "Absolvite," right? That you are forgiven. And that was the end of the conversation. There was no more to say after that. I got a little flustered, actually. Um, it hit me right in the middle of the chest as like a truth bomb, like I am forgiven. And that is the most important thing to remember. And it is the center of all of our conversation.
Oh, oh, absolutely. And even if he spent 2 hours counseling you and talking yourself out off the ledge, so to speak, right? There's still the stress. There's still the like you're still under the law. The ironic thing about the law is that yeah, it can motivate for a while, but the gospel frees you in ways that often you end up being more productive. Not always, but you end up being more productive. I tell my students all the time, like, I don't give a flying about your grades, and neither should you. And if all you are doing here is to get a good grade or whatever, whatever. But I'm willing to bet if you stop caring about that and actually care about the gift that God has given you, this learning in front of you, and Him forming you and flourishing you just for the sake of so that you're a well-rounded person, I'm willing to bet that your grades get better. But the beauty thing is, at the end of the semester, you won't care. You won't care. And at the end of the book, I talked about the idea of spiritual growth. That was a thing that we really talked about in the 90s, and that's fine. At some point, I don't care about my spiritual growth because I'm too lost in enjoying God's good gifts and loving my neighbor. I don't care if I'm growing or not. I look back and I go, yeah, I grew because God formed me. But you don't notice it in a moment, and you mature enough to stop asking the question.
Yeah, the more you talk about that, the more I want to chase it down. But that's not what this podcast is about. So let's shift. You mentioned a couple different times looking back and seeing where God has led us to and how He's used different things in our lives. Um, is there value in looking back and trying to see those, knowing that we won't always see how God is using different things? Is it wise for us to be looking back and trying to figure out how God uses?
Yeah, yeah, that is a really great question. Um, this has to do often with like, why did God allow this bad thing to happen, right? And like, classic Luther, he would be like, "You're not allowed to speculate, you don't know, whatever." And then he'll be like, you know, then he'll tell you about exactly why God allowed this thing to happen in his life 2 years ago, right? Guy never preached to himself, no. Um, um, Sometimes it's obvious, right? Um, this is no different than your everyday life. Like you didn't understand why the teacher made you do, diagram sentences. Now you do. You didn't know why your parents were obsessed with, a bedtime routine. Now you do, right? Some of it's just obvious, right? Some of it is so mysterious to us because we don't know the will of God, and again, we don't have all the information that we're never going to know. That's where trust comes in, and that's the same thing that we say to children: trust me on this one. This is not your business, and this trust me on this. This will benefit you. Teachers have to do that, right? Especially in math. Trust me on this. Just trust me on this, right? No, you're never going to use this, but just trust me on this. It's forming your brain in the correct way. Um, so the analogy I used in the book was a boy who wants to grow, right? So he has mom put a little pencil mark on the door frame, and he always wants to, he can never quite grow in the moment. You can never see yourself spiritually or physically grow in the moment. It's impossible. You can only look back upon it. And that's just because of the perspective of the science of like you can't see, it's too slow. right? Your height is too slow, but your spiritual and mental growth is the same way, right? I think a better word's formation. We can quibble about that. Um, but the end of the story was the boy gets to a teenage height and age. And now mom, because she's losing her baby, wants to put the pencil mark, the last couple of pencil marks. And he's like, Mom, God, it's so embarrassing. Well, what had happened? He stopped caring. He stopped caring, right? Now, more in his maturity, he's going to be able to look back at those things, right? And so this is one of the dangers of we can only speculate about these things, why God allowed these things or whatever, because we just don't have all the information. Just think about all the web of interactions that we go through in a day to day, the butterfly effect and stuff like that. I don't know. I don't know. Um, at the same time, and here's a very profound thing, is that mm, let me start over. Can I start over? We got time. Okay. Imagine that you got a toddler and your toddler uh, takes your keys and hides them. And so you end up being late for a very important meeting at your job where you're up for a promotion. You're a half an hour late. They give the promotion to somebody else. And you go back and you're like, I can't yell at my toddler, but I'm very angry. Why do good things happen? Why do bad things happen to good people or whatever? Hold on for a second. You don't know that if you were on time, you may have gotten into a car accident. You don't know that this job may have like ruined your soul. You don't know. You simply don't know. And by the way, maybe that car accident wasn't about saving your life, but about saving the life of that person because that person was going to go cure cancer or something like it. You just and then multiply those. You just don't know. But here's the profound thing about God is that is that those events, that event that maybe saved you from um, a car accident, also saved you from a bad decision. Like it can be both. Like God can do both things, right? And so when I look back at how God formed me, these events, including my suffering that formed me, it can be true to benefit me, but also true to benefit somebody completely else at the same time. God can do that. So, can I speculate that God put me in this position and I grew from that? And that was maybe an ancillary thing or collateral damage sort of thing? Sure, it's still meaningful to me. This is the genius of God to make me feel absolutely small and insignificant, and at the same time, the only person in the room that He's listening to, right? And I think we get that played out in vocation, right, where He's like, "You're a part of something greater than yourself," right? But you don't lose your individuality in that. You're a crew. You're a crew. You're not a number. You're not a cog in the machine kind of thing.
Awesome. Last question, and this is too big of a question to ask at this moment, but you can give a brief answer,
Uh-huh.
a synopsis. It doesn't have to be super brief, but um, you mentioned a couple of times, even if you didn't explicitly mention, theology of the cross versus theology of glory. And again, this is one of those that gets thrown around. And frankly, I
Yeah.
didn't really understand what it was talking about until far more recently than it should have been.
Yeah.
I was kind of afraid to ask the question.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by the theology
Yeah.
of the cross versus the theology of
Well, I will come back on later when my book, Peter, Theologian of the Cross, comes out next summer. Um, it's the same kind of thing. Like this was like vocation was sort of lost, and theology of the cross was sort of lost, and such a beautiful thing. Here's my short answer. Um, the theologian of the cross believes with his eardrums. He hears what God says, and even if it goes against his reason, he trusts it. The theologian of glory believes with his eyeballs. He sees things through empirical evidence and he makes rational conclusions and can speculate about those things. The theologian of the cross sees everything through the suffering of the cross, which is bad, but God said it was good. That means my suffering and his suffering is good, and I got to trust him. The theologian of glory looks at things and says, I'm blessed, God must love me. I'm suffering, God must hate me. Yeah. So it's about law and gospel. about faith versus rationality, and it's a way of thinking. It's a way of thinking. There's two stories, a cross story and a glory story. That's there, that there is so much. And by the way, that I the my manuscript's been done for years. If anybody from Northwestern Publishing House is listening, let's get that thing out. But it's a very heavy topic. Luther wrote about this in the Heidelberg Disputation of 1518. It has to do with like Aristotle and Augustine. It's very complicated. But when you look at the life of Peter, there's a Peter in the Gospels, and there's a Peter in Acts and the Epistles. Something happened. Well, I argue that he was a theologian of glory, and God formed him to be a theologian of the cross, and he did it through the cross of suffering, and specifically his Maundy, Thursday denial of Jesus. So telling that complicated story through the life of Peter.
Yeah, this is a whole different can of worms too. But we live in a generation where we have used the word epidemic, right? Anxiety,
Yeah.
depression, things like that. And at the base, what is it other than a distortion of reality?
Uh-huh.
Distortion of things that are real. Anxiety is a distortion where I imagine that everyone and everything is paying attention to me all the time, so everything I do matters in paralyzed. Depression is the same thing. I believe that I have somehow ruined all of this and there's no hope left. Both of those things are solved in the cross. And that's not to say the treatment plan,
Right.
but um, both of those things get resolved in the cross. And so a theology of glory is an actual predecessor
Yeah.
of the pandemic of mental health.
Oh, there's so much there. That's another episode.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Pastor, thank you for being on the show.
You bet.
Your time. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to hear more from Pastor Berg, you can click on the links in the show notes below. I'll ask you to send those over. There, Let the Birds Fly podcast and things like that. And any of the links that you want to put out.
Sure.
I'll shoot you an email.
All right.
All right. Once again, thank you for hanging in there. We got a little bit of the original audio back in there at the end. I hope you could hear okay. Either way, make sure you click on the links down in the show notes below to hear more from Professor Pastor Berg. God bless you all, gentlemen and ladies that are listening around the world. We will talk to you again next week.